Good evening. I don't usually get very nervous, but just a minute ago I started to panic because I couldn't figure out how I was going to end this thing, and I started thinking, do we have an invitation song or not? So I'm glad Greg said something, so I know that when we're done, we'll have a final song, and that makes me feel a little bit better. I'm tasked with talking about Proverbs 7 and 8. And if you guys have been here or have studied ahead, you may know what we're going to talk about. If you were here last week, you probably heard Kurt talk. And I got to be honest with you, Proverbs 7 is a little bit uncomfortable. And I'm going to start with chapter 8 this evening in hopes that I talk for so long that we don't even get into chapter 7. I don't know if I can do that because typically when I talk and have class, people speak up and we have conversation, and that really helps me get through things because I know I'm pretty hard to listen to. So I've thought if anyone is not comfortable yelling out or talking because they don't think anybody will be able to hear you, just text me. And if I get it, I'll just read your question out. Or the other option is, come right up here and sit. So if anybody wants to talk, there's a lot of room up here. Solomon was a very interesting guy. And probably late last year, Roger asked me to talk on a Sunday evening, on the fifth Sunday evening, and it just happens to be in November, and I don't know if I'll get to make that talk or not. But one of the things when he initially asked me, I started thinking what I would talk about, and I thought, I'm going to do a sermon on Solomon, because his life is just a little bit intriguing to me, and there's a lot that we can learn, and I don't know if I'm going to get to do that, and I don't know if I even still will. But that was before we started talking about doing Proverbs, and so I'm glad we get to talk a little bit about Solomon and his thoughts, because if you think about Solomon, who he was, what he went through, what he had, he was the son of David and Bathsheba, one of the more interesting stories of the Old Testament. He had 700 wives, several concubines, and probably even more than that. He was very wealthy. He built his own temple. He had a fall. And I hope I do get to talk at some point about his life. But one of the things to think about with Solomon, we're going to talk about wisdom tonight. And one of the things that sticks out to me is that God's wisdom is so great that he can give us people like Solomon, someone who's not perfect, someone who had significant downfalls, and still consider him the wisest man that ever lived. And someone like Solomon who we can look to for an example, because nobody's perfect. I mean, there was only one perfect person. But we have several stories in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament, if you think of Peter and Paul, they weren't perfect, but we should model what we do after what they did, and Solomon was the same way. And I think that's part of God's wisdom, is to put people in places to be examples for us that kind of are like us. Because if God would have just written his word with perfect people that we could never be, then we might not be as apt to try to follow that. But I think it's encouraging that even someone like Solomon, who had downfall and wasn't perfect, they can still be a good teacher, and it's a good learning point for us, because certainly none of us are perfect. The other thing, as far as introduction, when we talk about Proverbs 8, I think that also is a good insight into God's wisdom and again, that's the theme we're going to talk about is wisdom, but God had enough wisdom to write things in a way that we want to dig deeper into it. And one of the things that we're going to talk about in chapter 8 is there are potentially different interpretations. And there are interpretations that could go in very different directions. But I think part of God's wisdom is He purposefully put things out there so that we try to dig further into it. Because if we just had a statement, here's what you need to do and how you live, we might just gloss over it. But particularly chapter 8, there's a lot that goes into it, and I think just the fact that we want to strive to look more into it and read other things so we can figure out what he's saying and continue to go over the same things, I think that's a good sign of God's wisdom. G. Campbell Morgan, who was a late 19th century British evangelist and biblical scholar, said, and he was referring to Proverbs 8, he said, "There is nothing greater or grander in all the biblical literature as setting forth the beauty and grace of that wisdom which has the fear of Jehovah as its chief part." I think that's an interesting statement, and the reason I read that is after we get through chapter 8, if you're still listening, then you'll have to decide how you interpret what we're talking about. And what I'm specifically talking about is how Solomon describes wisdom as a person. And so I'm going to go out of order, and I'm not only going to go out of order, I'm going to start in chapter 8. I'm going to start towards the end of chapter 8. So if someone can't hear me, if you would just let me know, because sometimes when I'm up here, I realize after the fact that I'm not being loud enough. So if you do get to a point where you can't hear me, just let me know. But if you want to open your Bibles, we're going to start in Proverbs 8, and I'm going to go to verse 22. I'm going to read through verse 31. Again, if you can't hear me, let me know, but I'm going to read 22 through 31, and we're going to focus on that for a minute. "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there was ever an earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. When there were no fountains abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. While as yet he had not made the earth or the fields, or the primal dusts of the world, when he prepared the heavens, I was there. When he drew a circle on the face of the deep, when he established the clouds above, when he strengthened the fountains of the deep, when he assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters would not transgress his command, when he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him as a master craftsman, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in his inhabited world, and my delight was with the sons of men." So who do you think he's talking about? And I know that it's going to be hard for me to get an answer. When I first read that, I think about Jesus. I think I'm wrong, but when I read that, that's what before I did this study of what I was going to talk about, and before I read several commentaries, when I read that, I think of Jesus. Jesus was there in the beginning. Jesus was there before it all started and helped him with creation. But that's part of what I want to talk about tonight, and we could talk the entire time about that. But I don't, after reading everything that I read, don't believe Solomon was talking about Jesus. God used wisdom and intelligent design when creating the universe. And if we represent wisdom as a person, which Solomon did, then we can say that wisdom was with God in creation. In the beginning, before there was anything else that existed, there was God, and God made something out of nothing. The first thing I want to look at is someone named Arius of Alexandria. When we talk about the very first part of that passage, it said, "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way." And Arius of Alexandria, he was around in the 3rd century, around the time of Constantine, and when the formalization of Christianity was happening. And he had the belief that Jesus was not God. And that's similar to what the modern-day Jehovah's Witnesses believe. And Arius of Alexandria and his followers, they looked at the Greek translation, and they believed that there was a word that was translated, and that word was I know I put it in here. Qanah. Q-A-N-A-H was the word, and that word can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. And Arius liked the translation that Qanah, or however you say it, was interpreted as being created. And so with his interpretation, he is saying that in the beginning, before the earth was formed, God created Jesus, or wisdom. And if you look at it from his perspective, he says if Jesus was created, then he had a beginning. He's not eternal, and so he's not God. And he had several followers that believed that. And I think if you look at the translation, the word Qanah was used, I believe it was 12 times in Proverbs. And in each of those times, the interpretation was that word meant acquired or possessed. And so if you look at it from that perspective, that God possessed wisdom, then it's a little bit easier to understand that it's not Jesus that he was talking about. And I know you guys are sitting far away, but if you have any thoughts about that, I struggled with that. But if you have any thoughts about that, by all means, speak up. But I think my main point of saying all of that is, if we're looking at Proverbs 8, we're looking at Solomon describing wisdom as a person so that we can better understand how wisdom relates to our lives. And I think after reading everything, and maybe I didn't explain it very well, but I don't think that person that he was describing was meant to be Jesus. If you think it does, by all means, let me know. If you have any other thoughts, I'd be glad to hear them. But I think that's about the hardest thing that I found in this passage, and that's why I wanted to address it first. Because like I said, we could spend the whole night if you guys wanted to talk about it, but if not, I think it's one of those things that God's wisdom of giving us the ability to look into things and the desire to get an answer to that, I think that helps us understand God's wisdom in itself. Anyone have anything? Well, then let's move on. Talking about that same set of scriptures, Solomon was a poet, and he was speaking of the creation, and he wanted us to know that wisdom was there and how beautiful that wisdom was. And wisdom was beside God as the master craftsman. one of the things that it says is he assigned to the sea its limits. God had to have wisdom in order to assign limits to the sea. And that's one of the things that really, the sea amazes me. I'm always intrigued watching Shark Week on TV when I see the depths of the ocean and what's in there. And the ocean is just fascinating to me. And I like to look at that as saying, God put limits on the ocean, the sea, and what can happen. And if you think of everything that happens today with the sea, Solomon, of course, would have been familiar with the sea and water and what all can happen. But if you think of the currents in the ocean and the storms that it generates and the waves that occur when they come crashing in, God used his wisdom to keep that within the sea itself. And I think that's pretty neat to think about. It said that he rejoiced in his inhabited world. When God was done, at least as Solomon's describing it, God was happy. And I think that's a lot of times we take that for granted. It seems like every time we talk about anything in any scenario ever, we're talking about how bad things are, how bad our politics are, how bad crime is, how bad the rioting is, how bad people make decisions. And there are a lot of bad things, but there are also a lot of good things. And I don't think we spend enough time giving people credit. Maybe it's because we're in the minority. But there are a lot of good things that come out of this world. Good people, good deeds, helping other people. And I'm not talking about in a church setting or within our group. I'm just talking about people in general. People are good people, and we tend to overlook that. But if you look at the situations that we have with the storms down south, there are always people lining up to help. Or any of the situations that we have that are bad in this world, people are always there to help. And we do good things for other people. That's not just us, but there are a lot of good people, and God is happy about that. Yeah, there are a lot of bad things, but we tend to just overlook that we're actually in a pretty good time, and we have a pretty good life. And I think that's part of God's wisdom. He knows that. He understands that. The next section, I'm going to move on from that and talk about verses 32 and 33. It's pretty short. Here again, wisdom is the person, but here wisdom is seeking an audience. It says, "Now therefore listen to me, my children, for blessed are those who keep my ways. Hear instruction and be wise, and do not disdain it." Again, pretty short section, but we just heard when we read through the first part, at least the first part that I focused on, how great wisdom is, how great wisdom was there in the beginning, and how great everything God did is. And now we're saying, but you got to listen to that wisdom. Wisdom's out there, but you can't ignore it. And you have to hear the instruction. You have to heed it. You can't ignore it or never give it consideration. The world, the flesh, Satan, they all want us to think that if we have biblical wisdom, somehow we're going to not have a great life or financial blessings, but that's simply not true. We need to hear the instruction, and we need to try to gain wisdom ourselves. So again, that was a short part, but now let's look at verses 34 through 36. "Blessed is the man who listens to me, watching daily at my gates, waiting at the post of my doors. For whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. But he who sins against me wrongs his own soul. and those who hate me love death. So blessed is the man who listens to me. Blessings come to not only those who are willing to hear about wisdom, but to those who are willing to inconvenience themselves to seek wisdom. And I think that's part of what we do is we try to seek wisdom by reading the scriptures, by coming to Bible class, by socializing with other Christians and trying to learn more about how to be a good person and how to live as a Christian and what God wants. And I think that's what he's saying here is it's not only for someone who sits back and lets wisdom come to them, because you can do that. You can passively learn several things. But it says, for whoever finds me finds life. And I think that means we have a duty to seek out wisdom. At the very end of that, it says, right in the middle of it, it says, for whoever finds me finds life and obtains favor from the Lord. What else could you want? I mean, we can have all kinds of nice stuff, but if we have favor from the Lord, is that not all we're seeking to obtain in life? I know that's a pretty high goal, but if we can gain wisdom and understand the teachings, then we can find favor with the Lord, and that certainly should be our overall goal. Let's look at verses 12 through 21. I, wisdom, dwell with prudence, and find out knowledge and discretion. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance and the evil way, and the perverse mouth I hate. Counsel is mine, the sound wisdom I am understanding. I have strength. By me kings reign, and rulers decree justice. By me princes rule and nobles, all of the judges of the earth. I love those who love me, and those who seek me diligently will find me. Riches and honor are with me, enduring riches and righteousness. My fruit is better than gold, yes, than fine gold, and my revenue than choice silver. I traverse the way of righteousness in the midst of the paths of justice, that I may cause those who love me to inherit wealth, that I may fill their treasuries. There's a lot in there. He's talking about kings and leaders and rulers using their wisdom, lawmakers. Boy, wouldn't it be nice if we focused a little bit more on that? The wisdom that we could obtain and how we could use that in making decisions that affect our country and our laws and our world. I'll run through this pretty quickly, but where prudence, self-control, and good judgment is found, wisdom will also be found. A life given to impulses and extremes, that's not the way to find wisdom, and it's not the way to put wisdom to good use. It says the fear of the Lord is to hate evil. Reverence for God and what comes with that. It's not neutral towards evil. There is no middle ground. It hates evil. And that's something that we probably don't think a whole lot about, because sometimes we think, well, we can do things wrong and it's really not that bad. But God's wisdom hates evil, and sometimes it's hard to stay away from. But I think it's important that we know that our actions do matter, and of course that's a topic for another day. But God's wisdom hates evil. I found a quote from a guy named Adam Clarke. He's a British theologian and a Bible scholar. And if I'm looking back up to the part where it says, I have strength, here's what Adam Clarke says. Speaking still of wisdom as communicating rays of light to man, it enables him to bring everything to his aid, to construct machines by which one man can do the work of hundreds. From it comes all mathematical learning, all mechanical knowledge. From it originally came the inclined plane, the wedge, the screw, the pulley, and all its multiplications, and the lever, and all its combinations and varieties came from this wisdom. And all these things can produce prodigies of power, far surpassing all kinds of animal energy and the effects of the utmost efforts of muscular force. He said that in the mid-1700s. And what he was saying is, we use the wisdom that we get to improve what we have. And not only is that the case back in the 1700s, but it's the case now. Any thoughts? I'm going to go back to the beginning of chapter 8 now and look at verses 1 through 3. If you want to look there. It says, does not wisdom cry out, and understanding lift up her voice? She takes her stand on top of the high hill, beside the way where the paths meet. She cries out by the gates, at the entry of the city, and the entrance of the doors. I'm sorry I have to keep taking drinks of coffee. I think Tom talked about it, how dry your mouth gets, and it doesn't help any to have those masks on. I just don't like to drink water, so I'm drinking coffee. Don't worry, though, it won't keep me up. I can drink coffee laying in my bed at night and 5 minutes later be asleep. So don't worry about me. I'll get through the night. So as in a lot of other of the Proverbs, Solomon talks about wisdom as if it was a person. Here specifically talks about wisdom being a woman, and that's going to be in contrast to what we just talked about, or what we're going to talk about from Proverbs chapter 7, where we had the immoral woman, and of course the chapters leading up to that. But it says here, wisdom takes her stand on top of the high hill. Wisdom is not hidden at all. It cries out to anyone who will listen. And one of the things that I want to point out, you've probably thought about this before, but wisdom is not just set aside for academics or professionals or preachers or people who study scriptures all the time in their professional roles. But wisdom is there for anyone who will look for it, any ordinary person. You and me, we can get as much wisdom as anyone else because it's available to us and we just have to seek it out. And so I think that's a little bit different than historically we have people in positions, especially in different religious settings, who set themselves apart as being more well-versed or smarter or able to do certain things. But I think what Solomon is saying here is wisdom is out there for all of us. It's not hidden up on a high hill that's hard to find. It's out there. We just have to look for it. Adam Clarke, I just talked about him. He was a Methodist, and sometimes, I don't agree with everything that he says, but sometimes you find someone who has a couple of good quotes, and even though I don't believe in everything that he says, I like this quote too. He said, There are, it is true, temples, synagogues, churches, chapels, etc., but hundreds of thousands never frequent them, and therefore do not hear the voice of truth. Wisdom, therefore, must go to them, if she wishes them to receive her instruction. Hence the zealous ministers of Christ go still to the highways and hedges, to the mountains and plains, to the ships and the cottages, to persuade sinners to turn from their error of their ways and accept that redemption which was procured by the sacrificial offering of Jesus Christ. And I like that because it says there are a lot of religious bodies, there are a lot of different groups, but there are a lot of people that don't have access to that. And there are a lot of people in this world who on their own can find wisdom, and that's part of God's wisdom as He gave it to us right here. And that's all we need. So let's look at verses 4 through 11, and I might get my goal of not talking about chapter 7. We're getting close. To you, O men, I call, and my voice is to the sons of men. O you simple ones, understand prudence, and you fools, be of an understanding heart. Listen, for I will speak of excellent things. And from the opening of my lips will come out right things, for my mouth will speak the truth. Wickedness is an abomination to my lips. All the words of the mouth are with righteousness, nothing crooked or perverse in them. They are all plain to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Receive my instruction, and not silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than rubies, and all the things one may desire cannot compare with her. Again, Solomon was speaking to everyone here, and it's interesting that probably one of the most wealthy people, certainly at the time, but maybe ever, is saying that you can't compare the riches of the world or anything that you can get with the wisdom that you can obtain. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it, because Solomon very easily could have not been a good example or not given us the poetry that he did because of his standing in the world. He was very wealthy, and he still says, look, everything that I have, it's not worth the wisdom that's out there that you can obtain. Any questions about that? I could dig a little bit further into it, but I'm gonna rush through chapter 7 a little bit just so I don't get fired. Chapter 7, that's the story of seduction. And I'm certainly glad my kids aren't here tonight. I'm not ready to talk about this with them, even though at some point that will come up. The verses 1 through 4 kind of lay the foundation, and it's almost identical to what Michael talked about a couple of weeks ago. He's talking to his son, and I know Michael can appreciate that, and will as the years go on. I can appreciate that because I think about it daily when I say, take my wisdom, take what I have to say, try to act like me. That might not be good, but that's what goes through my head. So any of you who have kids, grandkids, or even a parent who you felt was wise, what he's saying here is, listen to me. He says it a little more poetically than I would, but he's just saying, listen to what I say. And he's urging his son. He says, my son, keep my words and treasure my commands within you. But keep my commands and live, and my law is the apple of your eye. Bind them on your fingers, write them on the tablets of your heart. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your nearest kin. So this is basically a plea saying, again, listen to me. These words are important. Live by them. And And I can certainly understand where he was coming from and trying to convince someone there are a lot of bad things out there, and you need to do everything you can not to fall victim to that. He says, write them on the tablet of your heart. He's not just saying read the words and move on. He's saying ingrain them in your head, ingrain them in your heart. Listen to them, act on them. It says, verse number 5, that they may keep you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words. Could probably get myself into trouble talking about women. I am not going to go any further into that verse other than to say Solomon had 700 wives, 300 concubines. He probably knew what he was talking about. So we go on, verses 6 through 9, we talk about the story of the seduction. It says, for at the window of my house I looked through my lattice and saw among the simple, I perceived among the youths, a young man devoid of understanding, passing along the street near her corner. And he took the path to her house in the twilight, in the evening, in the black and dark of night. Solomon was saying that there was a simple young man. Now, he wasn't saying intellectually. He wasn't saying that he was mentally challenged. What he was saying was he was young and inexperienced. Among the youths, a young man. It was repeated a couple of times. And simply to put out there that this man that he was talking about, this young man, was formidable, didn't know exactly what he was doing. That's probably a position most of us have been in as far as being younger and impressionable and able to fall into different temptations. And if we don't get too far into it, the purpose of what I think Solomon is saying is you need to use wisdom and gain wisdom so that you're not putting yourself into those positions, because that's part of what he was saying is the young man didn't really get the consequences of what he was getting himself into. Our world tells us to have fun while you're young, do whatever you need to do. You can worry about being religious when you get older. And I don't think that's the story that Solomon was portraying. It's not hard to understand why that young man would fall into temptation. And we're not going to go in depth of what all she said and how she seduced him, but that was probably a situation that he had a hard time turning away from. And hopefully Solomon is saying if you gain wisdom, you can keep yourself out of that position and not have to deal with that type of temptation. 13 through 18. So she caught him and kissed him. I'm sorry, I'm going to back up to 10 through 12. I missed that. And there a woman met him with the attire of a harlot and a crafty heart. She was loud and rebellious. Her feet would not stay home. At times she was outside, at times in the open square, lurking around every corner. So she was clearly looking for someone in this story to seduce. So then 13 through 18, so she caught him and kissed him. With an impudent face she said to him, I have peace offerings with me. Today I have paid my vows. So I came out to meet you, diligently to seek your face, and I have found you. I have spread my bed with tapestry, colored coverings from Egyptian linen. I have perfumed my bed with myrrh, aloes, and cinnamon. Come, let us take our fill of love until morning. Let us delight ourselves with love. So she was clearly out to get him in the story. She does say, I have peace offerings with me. I think that's to acknowledge the fact that she might have been a religious woman because she understood the theory of peace offerings. She just would rather live in a way where her peace offerings were good enough that her actions didn't matter. So it said, let us take our fill of love until morning. She knew this wasn't forever. She knew it wasn't a continuing relationship. She was coaxing him in on a temporary basis. So then in 19 through 21, it says, for my husband is not home. He has gone on a long journey. He has taken a bag of money with him and will come home on the appointed day. With her enticing speech, she caused him to yield. With her flattening lips, she seduced him. A couple of things. She wasn't necessarily a prostitute. She was a married woman. And interestingly, she doesn't call her husband by name, so she's trying to coax this young guy in without him thinking that there would be too much consequences of it. Again, saying, he's going to be gone for a long time. I know when he's coming home. He's gone on a long journey. And so she was able to seduce this young man. 22 and 23, it says, immediately he went after her, as an ox goes to the slaughter, or as the fool to the correction of the stocks, till an arrow struck his liver. As a bird hastens to the snare, he did not know it would cost him his life. Of course, she would be difficult to resist for a young man based on the description. He probably didn't realize the consequences. Of course, it says there, he did not know it would cost him his life. I don't think that's meant to be taken literally, but it does or could cost him his spiritual life. So moving on, 24 through 27, it says, now therefore listen to me, my children. Pay attention to the words of my mouth. Do not let your heart turn aside to her ways. Do not stray into her paths. For she has cast down many wounded, and all who were slain by her were strong men. Her house is the way to hell, descending into the chambers of death. So at the end of the day, what Solomon is saying is, don't go down that path. Stay away from the temptation, and to help with that, gain the wisdom that is available to you. Her house is the way to hell. Of course, that's a pretty accurate description. But finally, I think what he's trying to say is not everything is as it's perceived. Of course, this young man thought he was getting himself into a good situation, not knowing the consequences and not thinking of what actually would happen because he thought he was in a good situation. But the wisdom that Solomon is talking about is the wisdom that we obtain that will help us to stay out of those situations. And that's something that, regardless of our age, regardless of whether or not we're the ones that are imparting wisdom on someone else or we're trying to gain that wisdom, all the wisdom we need is out there. It's up on the mountaintop. It's for us to go get. And Proverbs is just a wonderful example of how we can use that scripture to gain the wisdom that we need to hopefully not put ourselves in the bad positions. That's all I have for you. If there's anyone that needs anything, come forward. We'll help you. We'll pray for you. If it's your time to be baptized, we can certainly have someone help take care of that. And we're going to have a song of invitation. So thank you for being here. And if you need anything, let us know. We're going to stand and sing.